The document was 2 pages long. It had been signed twice, once in the confident, broad strokes of a man at the peak of his power, and once in the thin, trembling lines of a man who knew he was running out of time. The first signature built an empire. The second signature tried to give it away. And between those 2 signatures, separated by 40 years, 2 families, and 1 woman who cleaned floors for a living, lived the most important decision Chief Emeka Oduya ever made. His family found out about the second signature on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, they had already made their own decision. What happened next is the kind of story that doesn't end in a courtroom. It ends somewhere much quieter and much more permanent. Stay with me. Before we go further, drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Whether you are in Lagos, Nairobi, London, Houston, Toronto, or anywhere across the world, Noble Stories is built for you. If this is your first time here, subscribe now. We tell stories like this every single week. Stories about quiet people, invisible decisions, and the truth that refuses to stay buried. Chief Emeka Oduya had been rich for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to want something. He was 74 years old. He had built his fortune the way men of his generation built things. Slowly, deliberately, with the particular patience of someone who understood that real wealth is not accumulated in a single transaction, but constructed over decades, one careful decision at a time. He had started with a small import business in Onitsha in the 1970s. By the 1980s, he had 3 warehouses. By the 1990s, he had interests in construction, logistics, and real estate that stretched from Anambra to Lagos to Abuja. By the time the new millennium arrived, the Oduya name was the kind of name that appeared on buildings. He lived in a compound in Lekki, a large, well-maintained property with a main house, a guest house, a garden that required 3 full-time gardeners, and a security gate that opened automatically because the chief had decided, some years ago, that he was tired of watching gatemen struggle with locks. He had 2 children. His son, Chidi, was 46. He ran the Lagos operations of Oduya Holdings with the confidence of a man who had inherited his position rather than earned it, which was accurate. Chidi was not incompetent, but he was the kind of man who confused visibility with value, who attended every meeting but listened in none of them, who had learned to perform leadership without ever having had to actually lead. His daughter, Adaora, was 43. She lived in Abuja with her husband and managed the foundation attached to the family name, a foundation that had a glossy website, impressive photographs from charity events, and financial records that a careful auditor would have found worth examining more closely. Chief Oduya loved his children the way parents love children they have quietly given up on, completely, without conditions, and with the particular sadness of someone who knows the truth and has chosen not to say it. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before the story begins. He had told no one except his doctor and 1 other person. That other person was not Chidi. It was not Adaora. It was a woman named Mama Chisum. Mama Chisum had worked in the Oduya compound for 22 years. She had arrived when she was 38, a widow from Enugu with 2 children, a son named Tobena who was 9, and a daughter named Ife who was 6. Her husband had died of a stroke the previous year, leaving her with a small rented room, a debt at the local cooperative, and the specific kind of dignity that refuses to become self-pity even under considerable pressure. She had come to the compound as a cleaner. She had stayed as something that the Oduya household did not have a proper word for. Not a servant, not a friend, not family, but something that occupied the space between all 3. She knew where the spare keys were kept. She knew which medicines Chief Oduya took at which times. She knew that he slept badly on nights when the harmattan came and needed his extra blanket from the cedar chest in the corridor. She knew that he liked his tea with 2 sugars but always asked for 1, as if the second sugar was a small private indulgence he preferred not to announce. She was the person who noticed, 18 months before his diagnosis, that he was losing weight in the specific way that concerned her. Not the gradual reduction of a man eating carefully, but the steady, involuntary disappearance of a man whose body was making decisions without him. She had said something, quietly, the way she said everything. "Chief, you should see your doctor this week, not next month. This week." He had gone the following Tuesday. He had called her from the clinic when the results came back. Not Chidi, not Adaora. Her. In the 14 months that followed, the compound changed in the way that spaces change when someone important in them is dying. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small accumulations. The chief's movements slowed, his appetite reduced. He spent more time in the garden in the early mornings, sitting in the cane chair near the frangipani tree, drinking his tea with 2 sugars and watching the compound wake up around him. Mama Chisholm watched him watch the world. She brought his tea. She adjusted the blanket over his legs on cool mornings. She sat, sometimes, in the chair beside him when the compound was quiet and nobody was watching, and they talked. About nothing important, about everything important, the way people talk when they know time is shortening, and small talk has become a luxury neither of them can afford. It was during one of these mornings, approximately 6 weeks before the story's central event, that Chief Oduya said something that Mama Chisholm would think about for the rest of her life. He said, "I have been sitting in this garden for 20 years, thinking that what I built was for my children. I am sitting here now realizing I was wrong about which children I meant." She had looked at him. He had looked at the frangipani tree. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. The lawyer's name was Mr. Eze. He was 61 years old, a small, precise man who had been handling Chief Oduya's legal affairs for over 2 decades. He drove a modest car, wore well-maintained suits that were never fashionable, and had the particular quality of absolute discretion that made him, in the chief's estimation, the most valuable person on his payroll. Mr. Eze arrived at the Lekki compound on a Wednesday morning in October. He came alone. He parked his car inside the gate and walked directly to the chief's study, a room on the ground floor with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a large mahogany desk, and windows that looked onto the garden where the frangipani tree was in bloom. They were in the study for 3 hours. When Mr. Eze left, he carried a sealed document in a brown envelope under his arm. The chief remained in his study for a long time after. Mama Chisholm brought him lunch at 1 o'clock. She set it on the side table near his chair and turned to leave. He said, "Chisholm, sit down." She sat. He told her what the document contained. He told her carefully, in the specific order that a man chooses when he has spent a long time deciding how to say something and has finally decided to say it simply. The original will, signed 40 years ago, updated twice since, left the entirety of Oduya Holdings and the family estate to Chidi and Adaora in equal shares, with provisions for the foundation and various business interests. The new document, signed that morning in Mr. Eze's presence, changed one specific thing: a trust. Established in the names of Tobena and Ife, Mama Chisholm's children. Funded with 15% of the total estate value. Held until Tobena turned 35, which was 4 years away. The trust included the compound's guest house, a specified portion of the real estate portfolio, and a sum that would allow both children to complete any education or business endeavor they chose without financial constraint. The rest went to Chidi and Adaora as originally planned. Mama Chisholm sat very still while he explained this. When he finished, she did not cry. She did not speak for almost 2 minutes. Then she said, "Chief, why?" He looked at the garden through the window. He said, "Because your son came to this compound at 9 years old and taught himself to read using my library because his school had no books. Because your daughter sat outside this study every day for a year doing her homework on the veranda because there was better light here than in the quarters. Because I watched 2 children grow up in the margins of my wealth and become better people than anyone who grew up at its center." He paused. "And because the man who built this thing should have the right to decide what it means." Mama Chisholm looked at her hands in her lap. She said nothing. She did not need to. Chidi found out on a Thursday. It was not supposed to happen the way it did. Mr. Eze had been meticulous. The document was filed, sealed, stored in the legal firm's vault, with instructions that it be read only upon Chief Oduya's death. But Mr. Eze had a junior associate named Kelechi, who was 29 years old, ambitious in the specific way that makes young lawyers dangerous, and who had been quietly cultivating a relationship with Adaora for 8 months. Kelechi had seen the document when it was being filed. Kelechi had made a decision. He had called Adaora that Thursday evening. By 9 o'clock, Chidi and Adaora were sitting in Chidi's living room in Victoria Island, with the specific expressions of people who have received information that has reorganized their entire understanding of their situation. Adaora spoke first. She said, "That woman has been in this house for 22 years waiting for this." Chidi said nothing. He was doing arithmetic. 15% of the Oduya estate was not a small number. In a portfolio of the chief's size, 15% represented the kind of figure that, once removed, would be felt not just in the inheritance, but in the operational control of everything that remained. He picked up his phone. He called 3 people in the next 40 minutes. A lawyer who was not Mr. Eze, a man whose name did not appear in any professional directory, and his sister back. By 10 o'clock the plan had its shape. By 11 o'clock, Adaora had already composed the message she intended to deliver to Mama Chisholm the following morning. It said, simply, "We know, and you should know that documents can be lost." Mama Chisholm received the message at 6:47 on Friday morning. She read it standing in the compound kitchen, her phone in both hands, the kettle beginning to boil behind her for the chief's morning tea. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the counter, finished making the tea, and carried it to the garden where Chief Oduya was already in his cane chair, wrapped in his extra blanket, watching the frangipani tree. She set the tea down. 2 sugars. She sat in the chair beside him. She told him about the message. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The garden was in the early morning light, the kind of light that makes everything look temporarily resolved, temporarily peaceful, as if the world has agreed to hold still for a moment before the day begins. He said, "How long have you worked in this compound?" She said, 22 years, Chief." He said, "In 22 years have I ever let anything happen to you in this compound?" She looked at him. He looked at the tea. He said, "Go and call Mr. Eze." What followed happened faster than Chidi and Adaora had anticipated, which is the thing about plans built on the assumption that the person they target will be frightened into inaction. They depend entirely on the target's fear, and they collapse the moment the target decides not to be afraid. Mr. Eze arrived at the compound by 9 that morning. He sat with Chief Oduya and Mama Chisholm in the study and listened to everything. Then he made 4 phone calls of his own. The first was to a colleague at a different firm, a woman named Mrs. Bankole, who specialized in estate litigation, and whose reputation in Lagos legal circles was the reputation of someone who had never lost a case she believed in. The second was to the Law Society, reporting Kelechi's breach of client confidentiality. The third was to a notary, who arrived at the compound by noon to witness and register an additional legal instrument, a statutory declaration signed by Chief Oduya, in the presence of two independent witnesses, affirming the contents and intentions of the new document, in terms that made its provisions significantly harder to challenge. The fourth call was to Chidi. Mr. Eze did not raise his voice. He explained, in the measured, precise tones of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years, what had been done that morning and what it meant. He explained that the document was now registered, witnessed, and supported by a statutory declaration. He explained that any attempt to interfere with it would constitute a criminal offense, in addition to a civil one. He explained that Mrs. Bankole had already been retained and was prepared to act. Then he said, "Your father asked me to tell you something." Chidi waited. He said, "I am still alive, and while I am alive, what I have decided is what stands." Chief Emeka Oduya died on a Sunday morning, 11 weeks after the Thursday evening that changed everything. He died in the garden, in his cane chair, near the frangipani tree that was still in bloom. Mama Chisom found him at 7 in the morning when she brought his tea. He looked, she would later say, like a man who had finished something and was satisfied with how it had come out. The will was read 10 days later. Chidi and Adaora sat on one side of Mr. Eze's conference table. Mrs. Bankole sat on the other side, beside Mama Chisom, who was dressed in a plain black dress and sat with her hands folded in her lap, the way she sat in every room, quietly, without performing anything. Tobena was 31 now. He had used the years since his mother first came to the compound to build a small but solid engineering consultancy in Enugu. He had done it without connections, without capital, without anyone opening doors for him. He sat beside his mother in a dark suit that he had bought for the occasion. Not expensive, but careful, pressed, chosen. Ify was 28. She was in her final year of a master's degree in public health at the University of Lagos. She sat on her mother's other side, her graduation photograph already in her mind, already imagining the specific look on her mother's face when she crossed that stage. Mr. Eze read the document. When he reached the section establishing the trust, Chidi looked at the table. Adaora looked at the window. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Mrs. Bankole had been thorough. The statutory declaration had been thorough. Chief Oduya, in the thin, trembling signature of a man who knew he was running out of time, had been thorough. The second signature held. After the reading, in the corridor outside Mr. Eze's office, Chidi passed Mama Chisom on his way to the elevator. He stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had made his father's tea for 22 years, who had folded his father's blankets, who had sat beside his father in the garden, on the mornings when nobody else was there. He said nothing. She met his eyes without flinching, without anger, without triumph, with the steady, complete gaze of a woman who has never needed anyone's permission to know her own worth. He walked to the elevator. The doors closed. Mama Chisom stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the conference room where her children were waiting. Tobena was standing by the window. Ify had her hand over her mouth. Both of them looked at their mother when she came through the door. She sat down at the table. She looked at her children, this son who had taught himself to read in a rich man's library, this daughter who had done her homework by borrowed light on a rich man's veranda, and she felt something move through her that was not quite joy and not quite grief, and was more total than either. She said, "Your father would have been proud." She said it quietly. She said it the way she said everything, without performance, without announcement, as if the truth were simply a thing you stated, when the moment required it, and then allowed to sit in the room and do its own work. The room was quiet. Outside the window, Lagos continued, loud, indifferent, relentless, the city that had never once made anything easy for people like them. They sat in the quiet together. It was enough. It was more than enough. There is a particular kind of power that the world does not put in the history books. It does not appear in boardroom decisions or court judgments, or the signatures on company documents. Though sometimes, if you look carefully, it shapes all of those things from the outside. It is the power of a person who shows up, who does the work without being asked to be seen doing it, who earns trust not by performing trustworthiness, but by simply being trustworthy, consistently, across 22 years of Tuesday mornings and garden chairs and tea with 2 sugars, and the kind of attention that notices when a man is losing weight in a way that worries her. Chief Emeka Oduya did not leave Mama Chisom's children a fortune. He left them a foundation, a beginning, the specific kind of resource that does not create dependency, but removes the single obstacle that had been standing between 2 capable people and the full expression of what they were already capable of. He saw them. In a world that had spent decades looking past them, he saw them. And he used the last instrument available to him, a pen, a document, a second signature in a trembling hand, to make sure that what he saw was recorded somewhere permanent. That is what the second signature was. Not a gift, a record. Proof that someone was paying attention. And sometimes that is the most powerful thing one person can leave another. The evidence that they were seen. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the quiet ones are often the ones who have already earned everything, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Noble Stories if you have not already. Every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about dignity, about people who were overlooked, about the truth that finds its way through no matter how many hands try to stop it. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And tell us, have you ever known someone who was invisible to the world but absolutely essential to the people who mattered most? We will see you in the next one.